Thank you to the three of you for being here, and thank you for the work that your committee has been doing over the past weeks to produce the report that you have just presented. I have a couple of questions. I'll ask them in English.
To a question that my colleague Senator Seidman was questioning, and when we were talking about Mr. Jean-Marc Fournier, can you speak to the constitutional question that Mr. Fournier raised during the hearings?
Maybe I ask Senator Dupuy. She's also a lawyer and a professor. She can certainly express the constitutional issue that is at stake in there.
Et si vous me permettez, oui, tu peux faire en français.
If I may, yes, I'll respond in French. Thank you very much for your question, Senator. I think your committee, just like ours, has been faced with the reality of hearing a lot of differing points of view. It's a complicated issue and we have to prioritise what we do. So you will report on everything that you have heard, but I'd like to draw your attention on the fact that the first recommendation that was adopted unanimously by our committee was to amend the bill to specify that the provinces would have the authority to prohibit or authorise the sale and production of cannabis. And now the Quebec government very quickly came to the decision, supported by the Manitoba government, and before Minister Fournier came before the committee, the Manitoba government or Mr. Fournier decided not to appear before us for whatever reason, but the Manitoba government decided to support the prohibition suggested by Minister Fournier. And the prohibition, and there's no, in terms of the operationalisation of the two pieces of legislation, that is in Quebec, Bill C-57 and also C-45 at a federal level. But the Federal Minister of Justice, before the Legal Affairs Committee, made a speech, and it introduced a level of uncertainty, which is why Minister Fournier decided that it was absolutely crucial to clarify the issue as to whether the provinces did or did not have authority to legislate on prohibition or legalisation. Now, the reason is that they don't want to put the onus on the courts to have this drag on for years, decades. If it be a Quebec or a Manitoban piece of legislation, it would have to, Bill C-45 would take precedence, and that's what they were concerned about. So Minister Fournier, the Federal Minister of Justice, introduced a level of uncertainty, and that's why the provinces wanted clarification. In any event, there'll be a review of the bill in 5 years, and it's easier to say right off the bat, let's be careful, and in 3 years we'll see if we need to revise the prohibition that we have put in place. It's easier to do that than after the fact, that is to authorise it in the first instance, and then after the fact say, well, no, we want to change the law. Now, another reason we have made this recommendation, and it's our top priority as it turns out, and that is that things vary very much from one province to another. Even broadly speaking, there is a nationwide prohibition of cannabis use. So to our mind, it is important to leave it up to each and every province to determine what its own system will be based on their legal, social and economic situations.
Quick question.
Okay.
Quick question and a quick answer.
Okay. Your report recommends unanimously also that the bill should be amended to impose a limit on the quantity of dried cannabis or its equivalent that an individual is allowed to process for personal use in the home. Can you tell us which witnesses who testified before the committee supported this recommendation, and do you believe there's any constitutional loopholes in the proposed legislation? And have you heard any comments on what that limit should be?
La plupart des corps policiers.
Okay.
Les corps policiers ne pourront.
The police forces
will not be able to enforce an act that doesn't rely on predetermined quantities, because if you go in a dwelling and the quantity is over and above what is reasonable, you can be faced with someone who is selling. So we have to set a limit. We set a limit during the negotiations with our independent colleagues, and we didn't arrive at an understanding. We have a limit of 5 grams for minors. For adults, 18 years and above, there should also be a limit. We thought of 30 grams, 50 grams, but I believe that that will be part of the discussions to come, because we agreed to a limit. All of the police forces requested this, and now we have to agree to that quantity. Thank you.
We can certainly put you down for the second round.
Thank you.
I'm going to inject a question here because it relates to a response that Senator Dupuis just gave to Senator Poirier. You mentioned the first recommendation, and you mentioned it in the context of Quebec and Manitoba, which I believe is relevant to the 4 plants issue. They don't wish to proceed with the 4 plants issue. Now, this has wording in it. I just want to clarify, is this entirely about the 4 plants issue, or is this wording in recommendation 1 go broader than that?
Well, you want to
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that what we were concerned about is that the day after the bill is adopted, there is not immediately a citizen that go to court and challenge the bill, because there is uncertainty between the overlap of the provincial legislation and the federal legislation. And as my colleague Senator Dupuis has mentioned, unfortunately there is presently a question mark about the stand that the federal Department of Justice would take to support the capacity of a province to ban the 4 plans. Because the minister said, if there is a challenge, we will defend the federal legislation. So, fine, but then it means that you will have to go to court to spend out the whole process of first, second, third level before there is finally a decision that a province has a capacity to ban the 4 plans.
So when you talk about cultivation, harvesting, etc., you're not talking about the licensed facilities that come under the federal jurisdiction.
No, not at all.
You're just talking about the home cultivation.
Absolutely.
Thank you very
Oui,
much.
et
That's
donc
exactly
on parle seulement des articles du projet de loi C-45.
We're just talking about the sections in Bill C-45 that deal with the ability to possess, cultivate, harvest, and multiply plants.
Surgical in our way of approaching this to be sure that we save the largest part possible of the federal legislation in the way we frame it.